We're on the New South Wales Central Coast tonight, an area that's had its fair share of natural disasters. On our panel, Federal Health Minister Mark Butler, Climate Change Authority Chair Matt Kean, Shadow Assistant Minister for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Hollie Hughes, Policy Strategist Parnell McGuinness, and News Corp columnist Hildebrand. Now, the Prime Minister said today insurance companies are ripping us off. Are they? Welcome to Q&A. We're broadcasting on Darkinjung land tonight, and you can watch the program on iView and YouTube. Now, before we get into it tonight, the Prime Minister says that insurers are ripping us off. Joe, is he right?
Yeah, I think that, one of the terrible things about what's happening, say, for example, in Lismore, is you have the vast majority of people there whose homes have been completely destroyed. They're uninsured. They haven't been able to get their homes insured simply because, for all intents and purposes, insurance companies won't insure them. The premiums are so high that they're completely prohibitive and they cannot afford them. And you have to sort of ask a question, if you're not going to insure people, then maybe insurance isn't your game. Obviously, they don't want to take the risk. Obviously, they are there to provide for their shareholders, and that's all fine. You know, capitalism, great, fantastic. But you can't just say to people, well, you shouldn't be living here or you shouldn't have put your house here. These are people who often are living here because it's the only place they can afford to live. If you're talking about Lismore, you'd be talking about, people living in the towns, right. Often elderly people, people who are struggling financially, hippie bongheads who they're not going to be able to afford to buy another house.
So Parnell, is our insurance ripping people off?
Look, not in the way that Joe says they are. Insurance is basically a bet. I bet that something is going to happen to my house. The insurance company bets that it isn't. At some point in areas like the basin of Lismore, that's not a bet anymore. It's a sure thing that something is going to happen there, and so therefore it is uninsurable. That's where you get a situation where we've got to stop talking about insurance and start talking about buybacks, because Joe is quite right, a lot of those people can't afford to move.
But are they ripping people off, do you think?
I think that the terms and conditions of insurance contracts leave a lot to be desired.
Okay.
Most diplomatic answer I've ever heard.
Well, I'm yet to see an insurance company that's making a loss. That's the first thing. So, yes, they could be doing a lot more to help people. To Parnell's point, insurance is about, marking risk. And the risks around insurance is changing because of our changing climate. So there are just parts of our country, places around the world that are now becoming too risky for insurers to be able to insure. And that's something that we need to deal with. We need to have more transparency about what that risk looks like so that people can make better decisions about where they buy property, where they invest in assets, where they build livelihoods. That's how the market works. But government should be absolutely doing everything they can to make sure those insurance companies maintain their social licence and do what they're meant to be doing, looking after their customers.
Look, if you live in an area like Moree that you know it's going to flood, you build houses that are up off the ground. And that's the way a lot of areas have coped with weather events that have happened, where a sunburnt country.
They still pay high premiums.
They do, and you will find, to Parnell's point, that the clauses don't cover you for a whole lot of damage. You might have particular flood damage, but not storm damage. And I think most Australians, when push came to shove, even if they thought they were well insured, would find out they were well and truly underinsured.
And do you think the insurance company's responsible?
I think if you look at the way insurance premiums have gone up over the past couple of years, it is one of the highest pressure points in inflation, which is why I think also a lot of Australians are underinsured because they simply can't afford it.
Mike Butler.
The only thing I'd add is for those who are insured, they want their claims settled effectively and in a timely way. And when 3 years ago floods hit from Queensland down through the Central Coast, down on the South Coast, we found that people were waiting for more than 2 years to have their claims resolved. We had a parliamentary inquiry about this, and I think what the PM was doing, what the Treasurer was doing over the weekend as well, was putting insurers on notice that we expect claims to be settled effectively and in a much more timely fashion than happened 3 years ago.
Okay, staying with this topic, our first question tonight comes from Rhonda McCormack. Hi, Rhonda.
Given the current situation in the northern rivers at present after Cyclone Alfred and the growing frequency of extreme weather events, many Australians will be struggling to afford insurance coverage. Do we just say, oh, well, that's bad luck for you, or will the government add a component to their climate change program and come up with another plan to assist those in severe hardship and without a roof over their head because they couldn't afford insurance?
Well, Matt Kean, I'll put this to you first, because you've mentioned that you have a climate change hat now.
Well, the first thing is that we not only need to reduce our emissions, but we need to adapt to the reality of a changing climate. So adaptation is going to be important, and that looks like building more resilient houses. Let me give you an example. Today, cyclone-proof building codes only apply to properties north of Bundaberg. The reality is that with warming sea surface temperatures, it's creating tropical cyclone-like conditions about 100 kilometres south of there. So we need to be thinking about whether we apply those building codes so far down as the New South Wales North Coast. So governments not only need to do their bit to reduce emissions, but we need to adopt our policies to ensure that we can deal with these changes in our climatic weather events.
I want to bring in Carleen York now. She's actually a former New South Wales Emergency Services Commissioner who led the response to the 2022 Lismore flood, and we're lucky enough to have her in our audience. Hi, Carleen. Stand up. We want to hear from you because you know a lot about this. The big difference this year compared to the 2022 floods is preparation time, right? How have things shifted since 2022, as you see them?
Yes, a lot of things have shifted since 2022. There's been big government investment in the state emergency service as well as the other emergency service partners and fire and rescue, which allowed us to recruit more volunteers, get more equipment, and we've put a lot of effort into our warning systems as well and the Hazards Near Me app. So we have been very conscious about getting that information out to the community early so that they can plan and prepare and prevent some of the damage that's being done to their homes or their businesses. And so that investment has allowed us, and we've seen it on this occasion, to move those resources up into the areas that could be affected that are under those warnings and really help the community.
What do you think are some of the hard decisions that need to be made?
Well, it's a hard decision by government of where to invest their money. Every department is asking for investment, but I think we've seen the good investment that New South Wales has given most recently has led to saving of lives, saving of property. But one of the other things is their planning rules. So we're coping and responding to poor planning decisions from decades ago.
What sort of poor planning decisions, and do you think those decisions should shift?
Yeah, well, I think some of the areas that we now know are flood affected, have houses in them, have businesses in them, and you look at Lismore. So we can't repair those decisions. We have to respond and help those communities. But it's really important that government look at the fire risk, bushfire risk, flood risk, coastal erosion in the local councils and state government about where they're going to build into the future and what mitigation, whether it be drainage or alternate river courses that you can use, dams, etc. And we've heard lots of comments about what we can and can't do, and there's views on either side, but they're the discussions that we have to make sure the community is safe into the future.
Thank you very much. I know you did an enormous job. Parnell, is this the right time to start having some of those harder conversations?
Every time is the right time to start having these conversations. We always leave them too late. And the truth is that these things are going to keep happening, and as Matt says, they're going to keep happening more and more. So we do need to be looking at where are they happening again and again, and people's lives are just being turned over every 3 years. Where we can say, OK, we need a buyback in that area. We need to, and not only a buyback, because something like this happened in Brisbane near the river, where it was flooding again and again, and the government offered a buyback, which some of the people owning places there turned down. And then they resold their houses on the market at more money than they were offered for the buyback. And there was no mandatory disclosure that they'd been offered a buyback. So that is a problem when that happens. So a lot of, especially around Lismore, as Joe says, a lot of the people in that area are very, very poor. there needs to be a buyback and probably also some assistance to find a new house, and we're in a housing crisis, as we know, so there's, some issues
Well, it's
around
an
that.
interesting conundrum, isn't it, that you make the point? I mean, we've got a housing crisis and we've got people in houses that are being consistently flooded.
That's right, and we need to up our building code, as Matt says. All of these things have to go hand in hand because, Australia, we have this weird situation. Like as white settlers, we've been here a couple of hundred years and we really didn't know the terrain when we settled it. So we've settled in really stupid places, gorgeously stupid places.
We've chosen very few places, I think.
Stupid places.
So, and that's a problem that's just going to keep revisiting us.
I think obviously we need to deal with the sort of long-term planning and the long-term strategy of how we actually deal with climate change. But again, in the here and now, it's a bit like there were a couple of kids who had this horrible, I live at the bottom of a hill, and they had this horrible accident on their bikes, and one of the kids was all sort of tangled up in a terrible way, and I've run out there and I'm trying to help him, and there was this sort of scornful-looking older lady going, well, they shouldn't have been doing what they were doing. And we know that they shouldn't have been doing what they were doing. Those homes shouldn't be there. But it's not much good to say to someone who's living there now, for whom that is probably their only asset for all intents and purposes, and saying, well, you shouldn't have bought the house or you shouldn't be living here. So we have to make sure that there is either a buyback or that the government acts, as I think the PM has hinted, acts as an underwriter or a reinsurer for the insurance company, so that they have to offer affordable policies to these people. Because, again, it's, people who are struggling to make a hand-to-mouth existence, which is why they are living in these areas, we cannot let them being constantly having their houses, their only asset, smashed and smashed again. So, but don't worry, the next time round will be ready.
Buybacks are pretty expensive, though, aren't they, Matt Kean?
They're very expensive. They're very expensive. But, for those people that are saying, the cost of taking action on climate change is too high, let me tell you, as the former Treasurer of New South Wales, I know the cost of us not taking action on climate change, because I had to fund the most expensive natural weather disaster in New South Wales' history, which was the last Lismore floods, and that followed the worst bushfires in the state of New South Wales' history, which followed the worst drought in New South Wales' history.
So if we continue on this trajectory, what does it look like for us?
Well, it looks like a very different environment. It looks like a very different economy to the one that we currently know. Again, it looks like whole communities being disrupted, because there will be some parts of the coastline, there'll be some parts that are flood prone that will be uninhabitable. And we need to make sure that we're protecting those vulnerable people and dealing with the issue of carbon emissions, but also building in policies that help communities adapt to the new reality, which is a changing climate.
Okay. Here on the Central Coast, there has been a proposal to build a seawall along the Womberal Beach, and as I understand it, many of the locals are deeply concerned about it. One of them is Mark Lamont, and you're one of the residents. Mark, I want to bring you in. Hello.
Hi there. Hi. The local community here overwhelmingly opposes the proposed Womberal Beach seawall, because experts say it will push storm surges into the adjacent lagoons. We have people from those places here tonight. And so they're worried that their homes may become uninsurable if the seawall goes in. So my question to the panel is, do you think that Womberal and other Australian coastal communities should just have to accept their beaches being sacrificed to concrete seawalls, or should local councils and other levels of government be stepping up in other ways to address this issue?
Now, Mark Butler, I know your portfolio, to be clear, is health, and we've got many health questions, but you have actually been the climate change minister.
I have the joy of climate responsibilities.
So you do know about this issue.
Yeah.
To that question?
So I know this issue is very controversial in the region. I know Gordon Reid's been very active around it. I think it's in a planning commission process now. But I think these are going to become more and more common, these controversies in local areas. I've got a very similar area in the beach community I represent in Adelaide, where a big concrete groin was put in place. The scientists said 30 years ago this is going to create a disaster in terms of sand flow, and it has. So we are going to have to do quite a bit about coastal protection, but we've got to do it in a sensitive way that brings community with us. And the first most important thing is to be all singing off the same song sheet. And this is the point Matt made. When I was the climate change minister in shadow, local councils, even between Sydney and Newcastle, had different approaches to sea level rise depending on what had happened at the previous local council election. Some had been instructed to take climate change out of the planning documents. I mean, it was just beyond the realms of reasonableness. And so you end up having planning approvals in places where there should be none, if you look at the science, even on a relatively conservative reading. So we've wasted 10 or 15 years in this country debating whether climate change is real, instead of doing the adaptation work that Matt talked about to protect coastal communities and consult with them about some of the choices, because they are hard choices. We know the coast that we love, that are such an integral part of Australia's culture, are under enormous threat. Like in most of our lifetimes, they are going to change. And for those of us who love living on them, who build on them, that's going to have some very, very difficult choices. But I think the lesson out of this, as in many other areas around the country, is you've got to bring the community with them and put options before them rather than just present one and say this is what's happening.
Hollie, Hughes, is that the point we're at? We have to think differently about our interactions with living on the coast in this country?
Look, I think absolutely. And I think a lot of the work that needs to be done is also around mitigation, to Carlane's point, you know, where there can be work within the river system and how things are pushed through, when we need to look at dams, where more dams should be built. You know, having lived on a farm and lived through a drought, I can tell you when you watch all of this beautiful rainwater going out to sea and not being harvested is heartbreaking. So there are things that we need to be doing. And the problem is we are always coming up against in community the group that wants it and the group that doesn't. And when we talk about mitigation, you know, I was down the South Coast not long ago where we had horrific bushfires and the backburning hasn't been kept up again. And you can see the undergrowth there that, you know, if we'd have had a terrible summer, we could have faced another terrible lot of bushfires. So we do need to make sensible decisions. They're not going to please everyone. Usually if you find you're pleasing no one, you're probably on the right track at some point because you're coming down the middle. But, you know, there are a lot of tough decisions that need to be made.
Our next question tonight comes from Jill Manton. Hi, Jill.
Hi, good evening. I live in the West Lake Macquarie area within 5 kilometres of one of the Hunter power stations. In view of the looming power crisis hanging over our heads, does the panel consider it wise to delay the replacement of the ageing coal-fired power stations in the Hunter with nuclear reactors?
Hollie, I'll put that to you.
Thanks, Patricia.
I think they want the answer to be no.
Well, you know, the reality is when it comes to nuclear, it's almost a plug-in, plug-out into the transmission system. What no one will tell you, and we've been asking for it in the Senate for a really long time, what is the cost of the second set of transmission lines required for the renewable energy projects? And the reality is transmission is 50% of your electricity bill. Now, the Hunter is an area built on power generation, work within the mining sector, lots of coal mining, lots of power generation. And nuclear would allow areas like the Hunter to continue to develop, to still be an energy hub, to make sure Tomago smelter's still running at capacity without having to come offline so that Sydney can keep its air conditioning on, that we can run our dishwashers whenever we like. I'm not sure if that was your suggestion, Matt, that we didn't put our dishwashers on a particularly hot day.
Too soon.
But, you know, I think, well, I'm sitting in the middle here, I'm going to get it, but I absolutely think that we should be replacing some of those coal-fired power stations with small to medium-sized modular nuclear reactors. The technology is developing. It'll secure jobs in this region and it'll actually give us zero emissions, reliable baseload power.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that the small modular nuclear reactors that you're talking about aren't even invented yet. So let's
go to Canada.
Let's get the facts on the table. That's the first thing.
Let's go to Canada and have a look at the ones over there in Ottawa.
The second thing, well, they're not small modular nuclear
they're medium-sized,
reactors. They're large-scale nuclear reactors. So let's get the facts on the table. The second
technology is moving.
May I allowed you to finish your answers. The second thing I'd say, you mentioned Tomago smelter. Well, the AI group, with their energy expert, Tennant Reid, only this week said that under the frontier economics modelling, that the Tomago smelter will not exist under a nuclear pathway by 2050. And for people in Wyong, that means 1,200 direct jobs under threat and 3,000 indirect jobs. So if people in Wyong aren't directly affected by this nuclear plant, they will know someone who will be if that Tomago smelter goes out. Because let me tell you, under the frontier economics modelling, it shows 40% less demand generated from the electricity system under AEMO's alternative pathway, which is the step change pathway. And finally, to your question, Jill, what I would say is that I don't think anyone in this audience believes that a nuclear power station that's not going to be built till at least 2035, and that's the most heroic assumption anyone has ever said, right, is going to help anyone with their power bills today. It's just not, okay? What will help people...
Renewables aren't helping today.
What will help people with their power bills today is more supply going into the system. And let me give you an example of a practical example of supply going to the system on an existing site that doesn't need new transmission lines being built. And that's the Waratah super battery being built on the Munmora power station right now. Private capital is flowing to it, jobs are being created in the local community, and it's spitting out electricity. It will be spitting out electricity once it's commissioned very shortly, and that will mean our existing coal-fired power stations can put more energy into the system because it's freeing up the transmission capacity, and it will allow more renewables to come into the system, providing more supply and putting downward pressure on prices.
Okay. Clearly, you're both members of the Liberal Party, but very different views on the future for nuclear. Parnell, you think there is a future for nuclear?
I think we should have started it years and years ago. Once again, to my point before,
but given we haven't, right, and back to the question about the time frame, that is an issue, right?
The time frame is always an issue. 20 years ago, when we were talking about it, the time frame was an issue. 20 years before that, it was an issue as well. Right now, it's an issue. I think with something like this, you just have to start right away. And the reason we have to start it right away is because this is a question of prosperity long term. So yes, it's not going to come on right away. And yes, it doesn't mean that you should give up renewable energy and other power sources. But if we want a prosperous Australia for our children and our grandchildren, then we need to be producing enough energy and enough reliable energy to be able to create things in Australia. You know, for years, remember 10 years ago we were going to be this knowledge economy? Mm-hmm. Now we're just a production sink, you know, productivity sink. We know nothing, we're doing nothing, we are just sluggishly moving along. So we need Australia to have a prosperous future, and that is going to be driven by energy, and we need geostrategic security as well, and that is also going to be driven by large quantities of emissions-free energy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yep. I think, just to Parnell's point, starting 20 years ago, we're not starting 20 years ago, we're talking about today. And people talking about building nuclear today are the same people that are sort of arguing that we should be building a blockbuster video complex when Netflix is already here. There's new technology. There's new technology which looks like wind, solar and storage.
Matt, okay.
It doesn't always rain.
Where are those wind turbines going when they're out of? Where's the solar panels going to landfill?
When we need to.
You know, it's a convenient argument.
The second point that I just want to finish on, Panel, excuse me for 1 second, this is that I agree with you. We need more energy. Energy supply into the system grows our economy, and under the frontier economics nuclear modelling, it will have 40% less energy than the alternative, and that will mean a massive hit to our economy. Under the frontier economics modelling, it's a $300 billion smaller economy for Australia. That's the reality.
Okay. So Joe,
yes,
you and I are the
policy giant, Joe Hildebrand. Yes.
Well, we're both journos here.
That's right. We know better than everybody.
Yeah.
Minister, get to sit out of this.
I've never seen him have such a good time.
He's really enjoying himself here. Thanks, Patricia.
I will bring Joe. Well, it's your policy, to be fair, right, Senator?
Absolutely, and I own it.
Yeah, but Joe,
are you still a member? It's our policy then. It's our policy.
Not the New South Wales Liberals.
20 years ago it would have been fine, but now too late?
Yeah, it's like the old joke, you know, hey farmer, how do I get to Albuquerque? And he goes, I wouldn't start from here. It's like, we're here now, aren't we? I mean, this is what, you know, my mum's special friend Don said when he didn't want to make 2 trips into town to the vet to put my dog Barney down. He said, "Come on, Chris, we're here now." And I never saw the dog again. The truth is, we are here now. So there's no good saying we should have started. And again, it's a bit like the floods argument. Oh, well, you shouldn't have built your house here. Oh, we should have started 20 years ago. I am completely nuclear agnostic. If it works, it works. If it's great, if the small modular reactors do end up coming online, they could absolutely be a game changer. But as Matt rightly said, they do not exist yet. They have not been able to be made into anything remotely commercially viable. If they do exist and we can plug them on the side of a smelter, great. If we can do it with green hydrogen and using solar and wind to create electrolyzers to fuel the hydrogen cells, they can then plug it on the side of the smelter. But guess what? That doesn't exist either. So we should be doing everything we can to make sure we have all our options open, so when that magic sort of thing does go off, we are there and ready, and we have the intellectual base to be able to exploit.
That's an interesting point, Mark Butler. That would mean taking the ban off nuclear. Is that worth doing?
Well, I mean, the problem with nuclear, well, there are two problems. One is it's too expensive. You're not going to underpin an aluminium smelting industry with nuclear power. It's the most expensive form of power on the planet. You're just not going to do it.
It's not just going to be aluminium. Let's be fair.
We're talking about Tomago.
We made an example. It's not going to be the only thing it's powering.
The second thing, it's going to take too long. The question was about extending the coal-fired generators. Whether that's wise or not, reasonable people can disagree about. It's just not practical. They were built in the 70s and the early 80s. They are about to fall over. When we have really hot summers, and thankfully we haven't had one for a little while, but when we have really hot summers, they just break down constantly. There is no way we're extending that generation of New South Wales and Victorian coal generators into the 2040s. And if we're not doing that, what's going to happen in the meantime? You know, because the idea of taxpayer subsidised nuclear power will crash renewable energy investment. So get rid of that. So there's no renewable energy investment.
Crash nuclear energy investment.
No, nuclear energy investment will crash renewable energy investment. Like the idea that you can build all this stuff, but down the track, this big taxpayer subsidised fleet of nuclear reactors is going to basically eat your lunch. It's going to crash renewable energy.
We're not going to have renewable energy.
Nothing happens. Nothing happens for 20 years while these coal-fired generators shut down.
But is it true that it would crash the investment in them? Because you say you're agnostic about the...
Well, we are technologically agnostic, and people invest with what's the best technology.
You're betting on nuclear,
no, we're not. We are technologically agnostic. We are looking at a full suite. What we're seeing, though, is this absolute ideological opposition to anything that is not renewables. We are seeing investment move away from green hydrogen at a rate of knots. We are seeing all of those offshore wind farms that Mr. Bowen wants to put on all of these coastal communities, that all of the funding is moving away from them, and those projects are going away. This funding will go where the success is likely to be. That's why people invest. They want to make money. At the moment, people investing in renewable energy do it because it's so heavily subsidised by government. They're getting payments back from all of you, the taxpayers.
Let me just say, I'm not anti-nuclear, but I am anti-nonsense. And the reality is, you talk about private investment. Well, there's no private investors knocking down anyone's door to build a nuclear reactor. In fact, under Peter Dutton's nuclear plan, it won't be the national energy market, it will be the nationalised energy market, because it will only be funded by the government. Now, I forgot when the Liberal Party decided to be socialist in how it operates.
How many wind and solar farms are being built without a handout from the taxpayer? Zero. Zero. They are all being built on subsidies.
All right. Now let's hear from Sophie Cregan. Hi, Sophie.
Hello. How do you suggest I talk to my kids about why one set of their school uniforms costs more than my entire childhood wardrobe, and that my mum's generation's aged care fees will rival that of a luxury cruise ship? And if I be lucky enough to find a box of eggs, why I may not be able to afford them? Is this just the vibe, or is there a plan to fix it?
Mark Butler.
Well, I think everyone in this room and everyone watching at home has felt enormous cost of living pressure over the last few years, and still are. They really still are. We're starting to see inflation come down, which is a good thing. It's down now into the 2 to 3 band. But, you know, there are areas, like Hollie was talking about, with general insurance that are still hitting households pretty hard. So by no means are we out of the woods, but I think Jim Chalmers has said the worst is behind us, we think, And we're still focused as a government very much on doing what we can to help households with cost of living relief. You've asked a couple of sort of interesting little case studies there. There is an egg issue, which actually is in most countries of the world, and to do with bird flu, largely, that a lot of egg-laying chickens are being slaughtered right across the globe, including here in Australia, which is pushing up egg prices. That's a sort of a weird little single story. Aged care fees, we are trying to do what we can to build a lot more aged care places, which we will need. Every nursing home I go to right now is full. And the number of 80-year-olds in the next few years, people turning 80, is about to double because of the baby boomer generation hitting that crucial entry age into aged care. So, you know, there are some interesting little case studies you've talked about there, but on the whole, we have been focused very much in our time in government on trying to deal with the economy-wide pressure on prices that's hit most of the world, really, since the end of COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've tried to do that in a responsible way that was matched with budget management. It's delivered 2 budget surpluses, but we know people are still really hurting in households, and there's still a lot of pressure for us to focus on. We know we have to do more.
Sophie, you sound really frustrated. You've got little kids, I understand?
I'm the cliche of the sandwich generation.
Tell me. Give me a day in your life and how it's been under the cost of living pressures.
I also work in aged care, so that's a really point of interest for me at the moment, and just how complicated it is to articulate to people the costs going into those sorts of care. My mum has been brilliant. She lifts the pressure off me at the moment, takes much of the load off childcare, pickups, drop-offs, so that I can work. I've got a really great community. The coast has been brilliant. Coasties hate people like me who've moved from Sydney and taking their beautiful homes here, but been pushed out of Sydney into places like this and have a beautiful community. So
just tell me about that. You say you've been pushed out of Sydney.
I could not afford to live there at all.
So you when did you leave?
We were very, very lucky. We left about 7 years ago, just before things really took off here. My friends in Sydney now could not afford to relocate here if they wanted to. So.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Joe, that's a common story, isn't it?
It's a really common story. And again, I think the 3 biggest issues in this election campaign are going to be cost of living, cost of living, cost of living, and then if there's time, more cost of living. There is simply nothing else that people are more worried about. And while it's great that inflation is going down, and this is a problem that the government has largely inherited and there are economic forces beyond its control, a lot to do with very, very bad decisions made during COVID, having said that. But just because prices are not going up as much as they were doesn't mean that
they're not going down.
They're going down, that's right.
We don't want them to go down because that would be deflation, right?
That's right. We don't want them to go down. You don't want them to go down. But again, just to give you an example, a little luxury in life, bit of Cadbury drinking chocolate. A couple of years ago at my local Coles, that was $4 for the big tin. It's now $7, and it's going to stay at $7. The price of eggs is going to stay pretty much where they are. You know, it is not going to come down. And so this is what Sophie's saying. This is the new normal. This is the new reality. You hear people talk about, the new climate reality that we all just have to get our heads around, or else. This is a new economic reality that we have to get our heads around. And if people's wages have not been keeping up with the rate of inflation, by the time that it does start to go down within that 2 to 3% bandwidth, then you are behind, and you will stay behind until you can get back up. And that is why it's just such a ferocious demon, and it's why, believe it or not, even though we've been absolutely pounded by all the rate rises, but this is why the RBA really, really hates it. And it just so happens that I was driving up here tonight. I just was listening to a podcast about the Weimar Republic. Like, you want to know where high inflation leads, it leads to really, really bad places. Once people see their wealth disappear, once middle-class people are on the breadline, then suddenly they start to look around and say the system's broken, and that's where you get this volatility. That is a large part of the reason why Donald Trump was re-elected, because people had gone backwards by tens of thousands of dollars.
And in the meantime, people want relief, obviously, right, as much as can be paid for. Hollie, Hughes, you're going to be, being in a budget in a couple of weeks. The government looks like it's looking at energy relief and other options to try and help ease some of these pressures. Are you willing to support it?
Look, there'll be things that we will have a look at and obviously be prepared to support to make things easier for families. But the reality is Australian families know that their standard of living since this government has come to power has declined, and it has declined significantly, and it's declined across the board. Groceries are up, insurance is up, power is up. We've seen in the December quarter alone 150 manufacturing firms in Australia decline. One of the biggest problems that Australia is facing is a lack of productivity, and there is so much red tape being put on everything. Inflation is still headlining around 3.2%. It's very, very sticky, and it is homegrown, and Australians are feeling it everywhere. Remember, you were told $275 off your power bill? Over 100 times you were told $275 were coming off your power bill. They haven't. Your power bills have gone up. They are continuing to go up. You got $300 bill relief. That came courtesy of the taxpayer. You, in effect, through your taxes, paid for your own bill relief. Power has not gone down. So the cost of living pressures are real. Joe is right. It's issue 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. It is absolutely the biggest issue for all families out there. I've got one of my kids here tonight in his school uniform. I feel for you. I've got 3 at 3 different high schools. I can tell you it is out of control, the cost of children today. And I couldn't find eggs anywhere on the weekend, and I did 3 supermarkets. So good luck with your search.
Okay, our next question comes from Morgan Cox. Hi, Morgan.
Hi. I recently got a rent increase notice for an additional $180 a week, which works out to be about 10 grand a year. I tried to find a cheaper place, and there just aren't any. What little is available, there's dozens of people lined up. Lots of them are immigrants, and they have plenty more money than I can possibly get. I'm already working 2 jobs, 1 more rent increase, and my family, my 1-year-old baby, we're facing homelessness, and we've got nowhere to go. My family's already been forced out of Sydney for the same reasons. I want to know, is the government going to cut immigration to match housing availability, or are we just going to keep going until every regular working Australian is homeless?
Well, I'm so sorry you're going through that, and it's a story we all hear right across the country, obviously particularly in the biggest states around the biggest cities. We have been working very hard to get migration levels, immigration levels down to something we think the country can manage. And what we've found after those efforts is that arrival numbers have returned to about pre-COVID levels, but we're not managing the exits, the people returning back home if they've been here studying or they've been here for short-term skilled work. And we're working very hard on that. So we do want to see those migration numbers get back to something like normal for Australia. We also know that migration has been an important part of keeping our economy going. You know, we also have a very tight labour market with lots of skill shortages. I know in health, in hospitals, in aged care facilities, we struggle to keep those operations going. So it is a fine balance. Governments of all political persuasions always have to try to strike, but we know we need more houses. Like, we just need to get building more houses, and partly that's why we have focused on a range of programs to get more houses built, including affordable houses. But we also need to clear some of those log jams in planning approvals and the sort of infrastructure that stops new housing being built, whether it's footpaths, sewage and water connections and things like that. So look, this is, I know that I think you got up to 7 or 8 as the cost of living. Housing is a huge issue in the community. Well, I would say health is as well, but housing is a huge issue because I hear far too many stories like that.
Well, housing is the #1 issue of cost of living. It is the cost of housing, and there are, you know,
supply as well.
It's supply. No, but the
number of houses.
The cost of living crisis is personified in the housing crisis, and there are people like Food Bank, you would know, does a report every year on this, and people are actually going without food because that is negotiable, whereas having a roof over their family's head is not, and so it's absolutely huge. And the migration thing, it is complex because, of course, one of the shortages we have is people enough people to build the houses. So it's a real chicken and egg problem. And also you can get your eggs at the smaller shops as well. It's the companies that make it for the big supermarkets that have been hit by the avian flu.
I even tried the butcher
if you go to your
if
little
they
shop,
had
they
the
often
eggs
have
on the
them.
side.
We've got almost a
problems.
show about eggs, but Morgan, your story is serious. You're saying you're doing 2 jobs, you're trying to keep a roof over your family's head. That sounds like every day is hard for you.
It is.
Beyond lowering immigration numbers that you like, competition for housing, are there other things that you're looking for?
Well, that's really the main one. And as I understand it, the government makes the laws and decides who comes in. So if you've got 2.5 million people coming in a few years, surely you can say to them, no, we don't have enough houses for you.
Matt Kean, you're a former treasurer, and in fact, not trying to blame you, but, you know, some of the problems that were building up in New South Wales did probably happen under your previous government's watch, as there was federal government. Like, a lot of these things take a while to build up. Sydney particularly has become a place that so many people can't live in anymore.
Yeah, I mean,
Is it an immigration issue? Because a lot of people are raising.
Well, I think it's more complex than that. I mean, and you know, that is one thing. But I mean, the reality is that we need more housing supply. More supply into the system means more availability for renters, for homeowners, more choice. Listening to Sophie before, I mean, her experience is not unique either. I mean, people are finding it hard to live in Sydney. They're having to move away from their care networks, their families and friends and stuff like that. And we need to address this. So I'm the Climate Authority Chair. So I'm speaking as the ex-Treasurer here today, and let me say that the number one priority for governments, a lever that they could pull, is making it easier in our planning system to get stuff built, because there's way too much red tape and green tape that is stopping housing developments, whether it be in Sydney, Melbourne or right across Australia.
Yeah, well, there's New South Wales and Victoria already working on that. But yeah, we've got another question now, moving to another topic actually, from Dr. Paul Duff. Hi.
Hi, PK. I'm going to read my question because I want to get this exactly right. I've spent 3 days trying to get it right.
Paul, I reckon you're going to nail this question.
While I welcome the recently announced boost to Medicare and the measures to increase the number of GPs, why should I trust you or any other government to not simply go back to neglecting Medicare and damaging general practice into the future?
You're the Health Minister.
You was me, not you.
I'm not in charge of the health system.
Thank you, Paul, for that question. It was perfect. Look, we take enormous pride in Medicare. We created it. We fought for it. It was a hard fight. It was opposed by the coalition for years. It was opposed by doctors, or certainly the AMA, for a very, very long time. And we particularly fought for bulk billing as a central part of it, as opposed to an American-style user pays system for general practice, or indeed going to hospital emergency departments. And what we've had to grapple with really over the last few years has been another cost of living issue, which is the cost of going to see a doctor, affordability. Bulk billing was in free fall when we came to government, is the description the College of GPs put on it, and that's why so much of our investment has been to try and turn around bulk billing, initially for pensioners and concession card holders and kids, but more recently in the announcement for Middle Australia, effectively those who don't qualify for a concession card. I know, though, that there needs to be more work done beyond affordability. We need to reform Medicare to reflect the patient need of today, which is very different to when Bob Hawke and Neil Blewett were constructing Medicare. You need much more wraparound care for complex chronic disease rather than just single episodes of care. And I'd love the opportunity to be the Health Minister again over the next few years, because I think there's much more work to do. And I've unapologetically said, of all of the pressures and challenges and opportunities in healthcare, for me, general practice is the most important. General practice is the backbone of a properly functioning healthcare system. And if general practice continues to slide, it will reverberate right through the healthcare system and then right through society.
You're a doctor in Woy Woy, Paul, right? You've heard the Minister say that he he wants to do more to deal with some of the reform questions maybe. Do you feel comforted by that?
Not very much.
It's a work in progress, this discussion.
There are so many things. I became a doctor when Medicare became a thing. I've been in general practice for 36 years. I feel like I've seen it play out over all that time. And I feel at the moment that this most recent announcement is Tony Abbott, Health Minister 2.0. I felt like I saw this 20 years ago when bulk billing rates were dropping. And it seems to be that it's a process of niggling away and not having Medicare keep up with inflation even, let alone the actual cost of providing health care. And I listen to the other people in this audience and I so want to say, I'm not a greedy doctor, I'm not after the money. I have been bulk billing for years. I have this intimate relationship with my patients, which means that I feel guilty about charging them money. And this is the way a lot of GPs feel. When bulk billing rates drop, it's not because we're trying to support our lifestyle, it's because we need to drop it in order to keep our practices alive. And as our practice slowly dies of old age and the lack of new blood coming in, as our 11-doctor practice was down to 5.5 at the beginning of the year, we've got a first-year GP trainee and a 60-plus-year-old local doctor who's joined us to make it up to 7.5, stares down the barrel of the next 5 years. 6 of us there are over the age of 60. If we all retire, and we easily could, the practice closes. And then there's just one other thought that came to me in the midst of all this, and then I'll shut up. The urgent care clinics. I know they're being touted as a wonderful new thing, but then I think, but hold it, I do urgent care. I've always done urgent care. I've always done suturing and dealing with fractures and dealing with injuries and dealing with coughs and colds, the stuff where people would come to the front desk and say, I need help. And I still try to fit them in, but I'm just so overwhelmed.
Oh, Paul, you know what? That was a pretty powerful story, Paul, or I should call you Doctor. Hollie, you've matched the government's offer.
We've actually gone further than that because
but on GPs,
but we're going to reinstate the psychology visits under the mental health, better access to mental health plan.
But on the other plan, you've matched it. So if Paul's disappointed, that's your policy too,
Paul,
right?
you know, we're on Dobell and Shortland here on the Central Coast of the federal seats. Now, Shortland is one of 15 electorates in the country with zero available access to bulk billing doctors. So if you don't already have a doctor who bulk bills and you come to Shortland, every single doctor who bulk bills has their books closed. You have zero availability to bulk billing in Shortland. And when we left office, bulk billing was at 88%. Under this government, so I don't know how somehow fell under us, it's now at 77%. And we know that the cost of living pressures that you're feeling is not just the cost that, you know, that people are having to take their kids to see the doctor and there's the cost attached. You're running a small business. Your power bills are up. The red tape that you're having to deal with about hiring and firing people, the restrictions around how you can hire people. This is all part of the impact onto your business because a lot of doctor surgeries are small businesses. But the other thing, you want to talk about cuts, pathology hasn't had a boost in a rate for 25 years. There's about to be a $356 million cut when it comes to B12 and urine tests.
You did it in the last budget?
Urine tests and B12 tests for women of productive age have just been cut. It's a $356 million cut to women's health. And even the RACGP, the AMA, have said that those tests prevent up to 3,000 avoidable deaths per year, yet they've been cut under this government because pathology is not getting any boost after 25 years. So this is a health system that absolutely needs a good look at across the board. But all we're going to hear from Labor and anyone else that you mentioned Medicare as a member of the coalition, ooh, Mediscare, because it's based on absolute
Quick response to that?
rubbish.
Quick.
But that's their only line.
Got another question.
Well, I'll tell you, bulk billing was coming down because Peter Dutton froze the Medicare rebate for 6 long years.
Can you give a sec, I think?
You talk about scary.
Can you give a sec?
Peter Dutton's record as health minister was not scary, it was bloody terrifying. And that's why he was voted by Australia's doctors as the worst health minister in the history of the Medicare scheme.
Are these the same guys who voted Wayne Swan best treasurer? They voted the wrong way.
It was not 88%. You were inflating those figures, by COVID vaccinations. The College of
People shouldn't
GPs
have been able to access healthcare during a
The election hasn't even been called,
College
guys.
of GPs said that figure was misleading, and yes, it was in freefall because doctors had their income frozen for years while their costs were continuing to go up. It's pretty simple.
I want to bring in Paul Hussein. Hi, Paul.
G'day, everyone. Minister Butler, you mentioned the need for complex care and to fund adequate care. So at Eleanor Duncan Aboriginal Services, we bulk bill 100%. So the issue isn't about funding, it's actually about the supply of GPs. I absolutely do honour the local GPs who've serviced our community for many, many years, but the new GPs we cannot attract to the region. They are going to Sydney or Newcastle. In fact, you guys are celebrating the Central Coast, but we're classed as a capital city. What a disaster it is for us as a service. Change it. But my request is specifically...
You did it.
He's asking his question. He's got the talking stick.
My question is specifically our sentiments around our First Peoples. They need to be looked after. They need to be given priority. Can you agree to allow some GPs to be bonded to our medical service for 5 years? So a medium-term solution is provided directly to us.
So when you say bonded, you mean, just to clarify, that they're contracted, that they can only get a rebate if they stay with your service?
So there are GPs that are rural bonded. Now, we are Rama 1. Rama 2 is a rural location which is not too far from where we are. So there are GPs that are bonded to those locations for 3 years. If the government is serious about our First Peoples and wanting to provide prevention and early intervention, give them GPs. We are a public GP service around the country. We don't do any co-payment. It's a point of difference. And otherwise, if you don't do that, you'll see our community in ED, not in the urgent care clinics.
Thank you. Quick answer on that.
So, I'm not going to give you an answer to the 5-year bonding from the stage.
Will you consider it?
Yeah, I will say, though, that we're very focused on this question. I mean, the Central Coast and the Hunter were changed to this point 1 or level 1 under the coalition government. I then made a distribution shortage area, which frankly hasn't really worked for the Central Coast because the college still required overseas trained doctors to go through their fellowship program, which they wouldn't allow. So what I've instead done is created a new pathway for GPs coming in from the UK, Ireland and New Zealand that is allowed to bypass the college process. That only came in just before Christmas. So already we're having enormous amount of interest from doctors from that area. So I know you've talked to Jed Carney and Emma McBride about this. I'd be very happy to have a discussion with you offline. More broadly though, having enough GPs, to both of your points, is a huge challenge, and we need to train more of our own, which is why we announced those additional training places. And in the meantime, we're going to have to get more from overseas, particularly for the bush.
Okay, so you're going to talk more about that proposal. Hollie, Hughes, can I get that commitment from you too?
Absolutely.
Okay, double commitment. Our next question comes from Bruce Cottrell.
Thank you all. We employ 3 apprentices, but have gone through 7 to find these 3 who I think they're going to stick through their apprenticeship. A lot of resources have been thrown into retaining apprentices, but I haven't really seen fundamental change in the last 10 years, and was wondering if there's anything in the pipeline to help qualify young people to take up a trade or manufacturing, to attract them for when they come out of school.
There's a lot of tradies in this area, and you run a business, right?
Yep.
And what are some of the struggles you're having?
Oh, finding staff. I mean, we just moved factories 3 years ago, and that's part of the reason we put on apprentices, because I couldn't find any trades. So we're having to grow them, which is slow and expensive, but that's just sort of what we were stuck with. But the retention rate, there are a lot of resources going into trying to retain tradespeople, subsidies for the employer, subsidies for the apprentices that are coming in, which is great. But it's the qualification, I think, at the beginning. A lot of the kids that we see are very keen to get out of school, and an apprenticeship is, the best way to do that, which is great, but that's not brilliant for me.
Right.
And so I was just wondering if there's anything in the pipeline that might help that process.
I don't know if there's going to be any announcements here, although I always go for it, can I say? But Parnell, there is a bigger structural issue, isn't it, in terms of the things that we have been...
There are, and look, full disclosure, I've done work in this area for clients for years. I'm not at the moment, but, I've had a lot of these discussions. And it's an issue which I care a lot about as a result of having, done a lot of reading into the policy. And there are some really interesting programs which are in-school-based programs. And the idea of that is to what you're finding. You're getting these kids who really just want to get out of school, and they don't often have the soft skills, I'm guessing, to show up on a regular basis, have the right clothes on, have the right attitude, and all of these crucial things to holding down a job. So one of the things that the in-school apprenticeships are doing is keeping kids doing things like numeracy, literacy, throughout, but while they're also doing a part of an apprenticeship. And that weaves the soft skills, but also the higher numeracy and literacy qualifications that they're going to need, as trades become more and more computational and have other requirements attached to them into the process. But look, at the end of the day, what you're experiencing is what I'm experiencing as a small business owner as well. And that is that people are coming out of school with far fewer of these basic skills of how to just be an adult. Like, we are not doing very well teaching kids to be adults anymore. That used to be the foundational thing that we were supposed to be doing. And so a lot of the time, like I have a 12-year-old son, and I feel sometimes like I've got him at work as well, and I'm teaching these kids, no, you need to sit up straight, you need to say hello to people when they come in, you need to answer the phone when it rings, you need to do all of those things, and they're kind of challenged by that, some of them, because they have not had these skills either at home or at school, and so they're getting them finally in a job environment, and you don't have time to be giving them all of these skills. So we need to look, I think, not just at the in-school apprenticeships, but also at just the broader sort of concept of what are we doing in schooling, and take our responsibility on ourselves.
Mark Butler, I'm giving you 20 seconds.
Very quick point. One of the really successful areas in our fee-free TAFE has been kids who haven't finished school doing some pre-apprenticeship training, the Certificate 2 at TAFE, that gives them those sorts of base skills to then consider taking on a formal apprenticeship.
All right, our final question tonight comes from Tanya Giles, but unfortunately she couldn't make it back from Wyong from Sydney, so I'm going to ask the question for her, and she asks this. Working from home benefits carers, those with disabilities, families, travel and time. Why does the opposition want to enforce back to the office in this coming election? Joe, I haven't heard from you for a little while, but this is a real battleground now. Working from home has become a big election issue.
It has, and I remember when, lockdowns were first announced and everyone said, I would be able to work from home now, and I kind of thought, this is never going to go back to the way things were, and there are some things that once, it sounds like the Lord of the Rings, but there are some things that once done cannot be undone. And if you give someone the option, say, oh, would you like to go to the office or would you like to just work from home today? Everyone, 90% of people are going to say, well, I'll just work from home. But that actually has a flow-on effect. And I work from home a lot when I'm writing, and I obviously come to events like this. I only leave home for Wyong.
Oh, same.
but you actually, it's actually good for you to get up and go out and interact with people and see people and be out in the world, even if it's not the easiest thing to do at 8 o'clock in the morning. it is actually kind of good for you. And I know I sound like everybody's grandmother, but I think it's good to get people back to the office. You have to have flexibility.
Grandpa Joe,
there you go, kids.
you've got 10 seconds each, you two, before we say goodbye.
Look, I think this should be the exception, not the rule, and I think we've got too many people who are working from home and not being part of the office. Most of the big corporates in Australia have brought all of their staff back, but let's have a think about the small businesses that are selling the coffee and the lunches and everyone in the CBD who haven't recovered.
Or in the suburbs.
Or in the suburbs.
It's a question of balance, like everything, and I think people feel like a lot of their rights are going to be taken away, the right to disconnect, that's going to be repealed under Peter Dutton, and this seems like more like a sledgehammer than balance.
Mark?
Look, it benefits my family, that flexibility, but I'm not a politician. I'm the independent
Now he's not a politician.
Just back to what I was saying about the kids. It is so bad for the kids because they are actually the ones who need work from the office the most. And you know what? Yeah. We should be all going in for them because they need to learn to be in the office.
All right, let's see where that all ends. We've had a wonderful conversation tonight here at the Art House Theatre in Wyong on the New South Wales Central Coast, thanks to our panel, Mark Butler, Hollie Hughes, Matt Kean, Parnell, Palme, McGuinness and Joe Hildebrand.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time tonight. We're going to be back with you next Monday evening. Go to our website to join the audience. Until then, good night.
There's a black cloud that hangs over our family. Lasher's out there hunting Mayfair women.
What have you done?
So much you don't know. You're gonna have a battle.